Dr. Emily Parker walked into St. Catherine's Medical Center on a Tuesday morning with the same lab coat she had worn the day before, except it wasn't the same at all. The fabric felt heavier somehow, colder against her skin, and when she reached into the pocket for her stethoscope, her fingers brushed against something that made her blood turn to ice. A photograph. One she had never seen before. One that showed her standing in a hospital corridor she didn't recognize, next to a patient whose face was blurred beyond recognition, and in the corner of the image, written in handwriting that looked disturbingly like her own, were 3 words that would haunt her for weeks to come. I'm still here. But what terrified Emily most wasn't the photograph itself. It was the date stamped on the back. 3 days from now. Emily had always been the rational one. During her residency at St. Catherine's, while other doctors whispered about the unexplained occurrences on the 7th floor, or the way certain rooms seemed to drain the warmth from anyone who entered them, she remained firmly grounded in science and logic. She had dedicated 7 years of her life to understanding the human body, to learning the precise mechanisms of life and death, and there was no room in that worldview for anything that couldn't be measured, tested, or explained. Her colleagues sometimes joked that she would need to see a ghost performing open heart surgery before she'd believe in anything beyond the physical realm, and Emily always laughed along with them, secure in her convictions. But that Tuesday morning, standing in the physician's locker room with that impossible photograph trembling in her hand, she felt the foundations of everything she believed beginning to crack. The previous day had been unremarkable in every way that mattered. Emily had completed her morning rounds, consulted on 3 post-operative cases, spent 2 hours in the clinic seeing outpatients with chronic conditions, and finished her shift by reviewing lab results and updating patient charts. She had worn her lab coat throughout the entire 16-hour shift, as she always did, the white fabric marked with the embroidered name tag her parents had given her when she matched into the residency program. When she finally made it home to her small apartment on the east side of the city, she had been so exhausted that she simply draped the coat over the back of her chair and collapsed into bed without bothering to change out of her scrubs. The coat had remained there all night, clearly visible from her bed, untouched and unmoved. She was certain of this because she had woken twice during the night, once at 2 a.m. and again at 5, and both times she had seen it exactly where she left it, the white fabric ghostly in the darkness but reassuringly ordinary. This morning, she had grabbed the coat without really looking at it, her mind already racing through the day ahead with its scheduled surgeries and patient consultations. It wasn't until she was standing in the locker room at St. Catherine's, preparing to begin her rounds, that she noticed something felt different. The weight was wrong, the pocket seemed deeper, and when she looked down at the name tag embroidered on the chest, she saw her name spelled correctly, but the stitching looked newer somehow, as if the coat had been made yesterday instead of 3 years ago. Emily told herself she was being ridiculous, that exhaustion was making her imagine things that weren't there, but then her hand found the photograph in the left pocket, and all her rationalizations crumbled away like ash. She pulled out the photograph with shaking fingers and studied it under the harsh fluorescent lights of the locker room. The image showed her standing in what appeared to be a hospital corridor, but not one she recognized from St. Catherine's. The walls were painted a pale green color she had never seen in this building, and the floor tiles formed a pattern that seemed both familiar and utterly foreign. She was wearing the same lab coat she had on now, and her expression in the photograph was one of profound sadness mixed with something else, something that looked almost like resignation. Next to her stood a patient in a hospital gown, but their face was so blurred it was impossible to make out any features, as if someone had deliberately obscured their identity. The background showed other figures, other patients, or staff members perhaps, but they too were indistinct, reduced to shadowy outlines that might have been human or might have been something else entirely. Emily turned the photograph over with trembling hands and saw the date written on the back in blue ink. Friday, November 3rd, 3 days from now. Below the date were those 3 haunting words in handwriting that sent chills racing down her spine because she recognized every loop and curve of the letters. I'm still here. This was her handwriting, unmistakably hers, with the distinctive way she crossed her T's and the slight backward slant to her eyes that had developed during years of rapid note-taking in medical school. But she had never written these words. She had never seen this photograph. And she certainly hadn't traveled 3 days into the future to document something she couldn't begin to understand. The logical part of her mind, the part that had been trained through years of medical education to seek rational explanations for everything, immediately began constructing theories. Someone was playing an elaborate prank. One of her fellow residents had somehow obtained or created this photograph as a joke, perhaps using digital manipulation to make it look authentic. But even as she formed these thoughts, she knew they didn't hold up under scrutiny. Who would go to such lengths for a prank? And how would they have placed the photograph in her coat pocket when the coat had been in her apartment all night, visible and undisturbed? She lived alone. Her apartment building had secure entry. There was no way anyone could have entered without her knowing. She examined the coat more carefully, looking for any other signs that something was wrong. The fabric felt slightly different under her fingers, smoother somehow, as if it had been cleaned more recently than she remembered. The pocket seemed to contain other items she didn't recall placing there. A pen with ink that was almost but not quite dried out. A crumpled receipt from a coffee shop she had never visited. A small notepad with several pages torn out, leaving only the ragged edges behind. Each discovery made her heart beat faster, made the locker room feel smaller and more confining, as if the walls were slowly closing in around her. Dr. Marcus Chen, one of the senior residents, walked into the locker room and immediately noticed the expression on Emily's face. He had known her for 3 years, had worked countless shifts alongside her, and he had never seen her look so shaken. Marcus was known throughout the hospital for his calm demeanor and his willingness to listen, qualities that made him an exceptional doctor and a trusted friend. He approached her slowly, his dark eyes filled with concern, and when he spoke, his voice was gentle. "Emily, are you okay? You look like you've seen something that shouldn't exist." She wanted to show him the photograph, wanted to share the burden of this impossible thing she had discovered, but something held her back. Some instinct warned her that speaking about it would make it more real, would give it a power it didn't deserve. Instead, she forced a smile that felt brittle and false on her face, and shook her head. "I'm fine. Just didn't sleep well. You know how it is after a long shift." Marcus studied her face for a long moment, and she could see he didn't believe her, but he was too respectful to push. He nodded slowly and moved toward his own locker, though she noticed he kept glancing back at her with worried eyes. Emily carefully folded the photograph and tucked it deep into her pocket, then took a long breath and tried to steady herself. She had patients waiting, people who needed her skills and her attention. Whatever this was, whatever strange thing had happened to her coat, or her apartment, or her sense of reality itself, it would have to wait. She had responsibilities that couldn't be ignored. The morning rounds at St. Catherine's followed a pattern Emily had grown to know intimately over the past 3 years. She moved from room to room with practiced efficiency, checking vital signs, reviewing overnight notes, adjusting medications, and offering words of comfort to patients who were frightened or in pain. Normally, this routine grounded her, gave her a sense of purpose and control in a world that often felt chaotic and unpredictable. But today, every moment felt wrong somehow. The photograph in her pocket seemed to pulse with an energy she couldn't explain, as if it were alive and demanding her attention. She found herself reaching for it compulsively, her fingers brushing against the glossy surface again and again, confirming it was still there, still real, still impossible. Her first patient of the morning was Mrs. Dorothy Harrison, an elderly woman recovering from gallbladder surgery who had been on the ward for 5 days. Dorothy had always been one of Emily's favorite patients, with her quick wit and her endless stories about her youth in rural Vermont. But when Emily walked into room 412, she found Dorothy sitting up in bed with an expression of deep concern, her weathered hands clutching the bed sheets as if they were the only thing anchoring her to reality. "Dr. Parker," Dorothy said, her voice trembling slightly, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to promise you won't think I've lost my mind." Emily approached the bed slowly, her professional mask firmly in place despite the unease churning in her stomach. She had heard variations of this request hundreds of times before, usually preceding confessions about medication, non-compliance, or undisclosed symptoms. She pulled up a chair and sat down, giving Dorothy her full attention. "You can tell me anything, Mrs. Harrison. That's what I'm here for." Dorothy's pale blue eyes searched Emily's face for a long moment before she spoke again. And when she did, her words came out in a rush, as if she had been holding them back for too long and could no longer contain them. Last night, around 3 in the morning, I woke up and saw someone standing at the foot of my bed. At first, I thought it was one of the nurses doing a check, but then I realized the figure was wearing a white coat like yours. I couldn't see their face clearly, because the room was dark, but I could tell they were just standing there watching me. I reached for the call button to turn on the lights, and when I looked again, they were gone. Just vanished. But here's the thing that's been bothering me all morning, Doctor. The person I saw, they were wearing a name tag, and even though I couldn't see most of their face, I could read that name tag clear as day. It had your name on it, Emily Parker. The room seemed to tilt slightly around Emily, and she gripped the arms of her chair to steady herself. She forced her voice to remain calm and professional, even as her mind raced with implications she didn't want to consider. Mrs. Harrison, you've been through major surgery. Sometimes the anesthesia and pain medications can cause vivid dreams or hallucinations. It's actually quite common and nothing to be worried about. But Dorothy was shaking her head before Emily finished speaking, her expression both stubborn and frightened. I know what dreams feel like, Doctor. This wasn't a dream. This was real. And there's something else. After the figure disappeared, I noticed something on the floor at the foot of my bed. A button. A white button, like the kind that would come from a lab coat. I picked it up and put it on my bedside table. It's still there. You can see it for yourself. Emily's gaze moved to the bedside table, and there, next to a plastic cup of water and a box of tissues, lay a small white button. She reached out with a hand that didn't feel like her own and picked it up, turning it over in her fingers. It looked exactly like the buttons on her lab coat, the same size and shape and color. Her eyes dropped to her own coat, scanning the row of buttons down the front, and her breath caught in her throat. The third button from the top was missing, leaving only a few loose threads where it had been attached. The evidence was right there in her hand, impossible to deny or explain away with rational thoughts about dreams or medication effects. Somehow, a button from her coat had ended up in Mrs. Harrison's room in the middle of the night, even though Emily had been home asleep in her apartment, even though her coat had been draped over her chair the entire time. She looked up at Dorothy and saw the fear in the older woman's eyes, the desperate need for reassurance that she wasn't losing her grip on reality. Emily wanted to provide that reassurance, wanted to say something that would make sense of all this, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she carefully placed the button in her pocket, next to the impossible photograph, and managed a smile she hoped looked more convincing than it felt. I'll look into this, Mrs. Harrison. There has to be a logical explanation. Perhaps one of the night shift staff borrowed a coat from the locker room. Try not to worry. You need to focus on your recovery. She finished the rest of her examination quickly, noting Dorothy's vital signs and adjusting her pain medication, then moved on to the next patient on her rounds. But her mind remained fixated on the button and the photograph, and the growing sense that something fundamental in her understanding of the world had shifted. By the time she completed her morning rounds, she had accumulated 3 more strange details that she couldn't explain. A nurse mentioned seeing someone who looked like Emily in the medication room at 4 in the morning, even though Emily had been home. A security guard commented that he had reviewed the overnight footage from the 7th floor and saw what appeared to be Dr. Parker entering the restricted research wing, though the figure's movements were strange, almost dreamlike, and the timestamp showed this happening while Emily was definitely elsewhere. And most disturbing of all, one of her patients, a young man recovering from appendix surgery, asked her why she had come to his room at dawn, and stood silently by his bed for several minutes without saying anything or checking any of his equipment. You know, there's something I want to share with you right now, and I need you to really hear me. Not as a viewer, not as a number in a count, but as someone who's choosing to spend these moments with us, diving into stories that most people are too afraid to even acknowledge. These aren't just tales we're telling. These are glimpses into experiences that challenge everything we think we know about reality, about the spaces between life and death, about the thin places where the impossible becomes undeniable. If you're still here, still listening, it means something in you recognizes the truth in these stories. It means you're brave enough to look at the shadows instead of turning away, and I want you to know that I see you. I see the curiosity in your heart, the openness in your mind, and the courage it takes to sit with these uncomfortable truths. If these stories resonate with you, if they make you feel less alone in your own experiences or your own questions, then please consider becoming part of our community. Not because we need the numbers, but because these conversations matter. They matter because you matter. Every time you choose to engage, to leave a comment, to share your thoughts, you're affirming that these experiences deserve to be heard and respected. You're creating a space where others can come and know they won't be judged or dismissed. So if you feel that connection, if something in these stories speaks to the part of you that knows there's more to this world than what we can see and touch, then join us. Subscribe not just to a channel, but to a community that understands. Because in the end, we're all just trying to make sense of the inexplicable together. By the afternoon, Emily had made a decision that went against every instinct she had developed during her medical training. She was going to investigate this systematically, treating it like a diagnostic mystery, gathering evidence and testing hypotheses until she found an explanation that made sense. She started by reviewing the security footage from the previous night, requesting access from the hospital's security department under the pretense of investigating a potential medication discrepancy. The security chief, a retired police officer named Frank Morrison, granted her request without much questioning. He knew Emily's reputation as a thorough and conscientious doctor, and he had no reason to suspect her real motivations. She sat in the small security office, her eyes fixed on multiple screens showing various angles of the hospital's corridors and common areas. Frank had queued up the footage from the 7th floor, starting at midnight and running through 7 in the morning. For the first hour, nothing unusual appeared. The night shift nurses moved through their routines, checking on patients, dispensing medications, updating charts. The corridors remained mostly empty, lit by the dim emergency lighting that created long shadows and pools of darkness. But at 2:47 in the morning, something appeared on the screen that made Emily's heart nearly stop. A figure in a white lab coat walked into frame from the west corridor, moving toward the restricted research wing with purposeful strides. The person's face was angled away from the camera, but Emily could see enough to know with absolute certainty that she was looking at herself. The gait was hers, the height was exact, even the way the figure's right hand moved to brush hair away from the face was a gesture Emily performed unconsciously dozens of times each day. But this couldn't be her. She had been home. She had been asleep. She had witnesses who could confirm, or at least she thought she did, though now she found herself questioning even the most basic certainties about her own existence. The figure on the screen approached the door to the research wing and paused for a moment, as if considering something important. Then, instead of using a key card or entering a code, the figure simply pushed the door open and walked through. The door should have been locked. It was always locked. Access to the research wing required special clearance that Emily didn't have, but somehow this version of her had entered without any apparent difficulty. The timestamp showed 2:51 in the morning. Emily grabbed her phone and checked her own security app, the one connected to her apartment's smart lock. At 2:51 in the morning, her apartment door had recorded no activity. The last entry had been at 11:43 the previous evening, when she had arrived home from her shift. Frank noticed her pale expression and leaned forward with concern. "Dr. Parker, did you find what you were looking for? You don't look so good." Emily forced herself to breathe normally, to school her features into something resembling calm professionalism. She couldn't tell Frank what she had seen, couldn't admit that she appeared to be in two places at once, couldn't even begin to explain the implications of what the footage showed. Instead, she nodded slowly and made herself smile. "Yes, I found it. Thank you for your help, Frank. I need to review some patient files now, but I appreciate your time." She left the security office on unsteady legs and made her way to the hospital's medical library, a quiet space on the 3rd floor where residents often went to study or catch up on research. She needed privacy. She needed time to think. And most importantly, she needed to figure out what was happening to her before the situation spiraled completely out of control. The library was empty, except for a single medical student dozing over a pile of textbooks in the far corner. Emily chose a desk near the windows, pulled out her laptop, and began searching for any information that might help her understand what she was experiencing. She started with medical explanations, exploring conditions that could cause confusion, memory loss, or dissociative episodes. Could she be suffering from some form of complex partial seizure that caused periods of amnesia? Could there be a neurological condition affecting her ability to form memories, creating gaps in her awareness that she was filling in with false certainty? She spent an hour reading about temporal lobe epilepsy, dissociative identity disorder, and various forms of parasomnia, but none of the descriptions matched her symptoms. She had no history of seizures, no family history of neurological disease, and no previous episodes of memory loss or confusion. Her last physical examination had been 3 months ago, and everything had been completely normal. Reluctantly, she expanded her search to include phenomena that existed outside the comfortable boundaries of medical science. She read accounts of bilocation, the claimed ability to be in 2 places at once, documented in various religious and mystical traditions. She found stories of doppelgangers, of people encountering doubles of themselves that seemed to exist independently. She discovered academic papers about time slips and temporal anomalies, written by researchers who operated on the fringes of accepted science. Each article, each account, each theoretical framework offered pieces of an explanation, but nothing came close to addressing the specific details of her situation. The photograph dated 3 days in the future. The button appearing in Mrs. Harrison's room. The security footage showing her entering restricted areas while she slept. As the afternoon light began to fade, Emily made a decision that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. She would go to the research wing tonight. She would wait and see if this other version of herself appeared again. If there was some duplicate or echo or impossible twin walking through the hospital, then confronting it directly was the only way to understand what was happening. The thought of encountering herself, of standing face to face with an entity that wore her appearance and moved with her gestures, filled her with a primal dread she had never experienced before. But she had spent her entire adult life facing difficult situations with courage and determination, and she wasn't about to let fear paralyze her now. The rest of her shift passed in a blur of routine medical tasks that felt surreal and distant, as if she were watching someone else perform them. She consulted on 2 new admissions, attended an interdisciplinary meeting about patient care protocols, and completed her daily documentation with mechanical precision. All the while, her mind remained focused on the coming night, on the confrontation she had planned, on the answers she desperately needed. When her shift finally ended at 7 in the evening, she didn't go home. Instead, she found an empty on-call room on the 4th floor, set an alarm for 2 in the morning, and tried to rest. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by dreams of corridors that stretched endlessly, of her own face reflected in countless mirrors, of a voice that sounded exactly like hers, whispering words she couldn't quite understand. The alarm jolted her awake at exactly 2 o'clock. Emily sat up in the narrow bed, her heart already racing with anticipation and fear. She splashed cold water on her face in the tiny attached bathroom, then made her way through the quiet hospital toward the 7th floor. The night shift was always the strangest time in a hospital, when the normal bustle of activity gave way to an eerie calm punctuated by occasional urgent crises. The corridors felt longer at night, the shadows deeper, and the sounds of medical equipment seemed to echo with unsettling clarity. Emily moved with purpose, avoiding the main nursing stations where she might be questioned about why she was still in the building so late. She took the stairs instead of the elevator, climbing the 7 flights with steady determination. When she reached the 7th floor, she positioned herself in a supply closet with a clear view of the restricted research wing entrance. The door stood about 30 feet away, its electronic lock glowing red in the dimness. She checked her watch. 2:37. If the pattern from the previous night held, she had about 10 minutes before something happened. She pulled out the photograph and studied it again under the dim light from her phone. The corridor in the image definitely wasn't from St. Catherine's, but there was something about the architectural details that nagged at her, as if she should recognize them but couldn't quite place where she had seen them before. At 2:49, the temperature in the corridor dropped noticeably. Emily felt the change immediately, saw her breath begin to mist in the air, watched as the light seemed to dim slightly without any apparent cause. And then, emerging from the shadows at the far end of the hallway, she saw herself approaching. The figure moved with her exact gait, wore her exact lab coat, carried itself with her exact posture. But there was something wrong about the way it moved, something that made Emily's skin crawl with instinctive revulsion. The movements were too smooth, too fluid, as if the figure were gliding rather than walking. And as it drew closer, Emily could see that its eyes were fixed straight ahead, unblinking, seeing everything and nothing at once. Emily stepped out of the supply closet on legs that threatened to give way beneath her. The figure stopped moving immediately, as if it had been waiting for exactly this moment. For several seconds that felt like hours, the two versions of Emily Parker stood facing each other in the dim corridor, separated by perhaps 20 feet of space that felt like an unbridgeable chasm. Then, slowly, the other Emily smiled. It wasn't a warm smile or a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who knew terrible secrets and found them amusing. When it spoke, the voice was Emily's voice, identical in every way except for a hollow quality that made each word sound as if it were coming from somewhere very far away. "You shouldn't have waited up. You're not ready to understand yet." Emily found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "What are you? Why do you look like me?" The other Emily tilted its head in a gesture that was familiar and alien at the same time. "I'm not separate from you, Emily. I'm what you become. I'm what happens when you finally stop running from the truth about this place, about what exists in the spaces between the patient rooms and the operating theaters. You've spent 3 years ignoring the signs, pretending that everything can be explained by science and logic. But some things exist beyond those comfortable boundaries. Some things are real whether you believe in them or not." The figure began moving again, walking past Emily toward the research wing door with that same unsettling fluidity. Emily reached out instinctively, intending to grab its arm, to confirm through touch that this impossible thing was real. But her hand passed through the white fabric of the lab coat as if it were made of smoke. The other Emily paused at the research wing door and looked back over its shoulder, and this time there was something like pity in its expression. 3 days from now, Emily, that's when you'll understand everything. That's when you'll be standing in the corridor from the photograph, and you'll write those words on the back, and you'll finally know why I'm here. Until then, try not to be too afraid. Fear won't change what's coming. Nothing will change what's coming." The figure pushed open the research wing door, which shouldn't have been possible, which required security clearance and electronic authorization, and stepped through. Emily ran forward, desperate to follow, to demand more answers, to understand what prophecy or warning or curse she had just been given. But when she reached the door and tried to open it, the handle wouldn't budge. The electronic lock glowed steadily red, denying her access, keeping her on the outside of whatever truth waited beyond. "Hey, I want to pause here for a moment because I know what some of you might be feeling right now. Maybe you're sitting there with chills running down your spine, or maybe you're remembering something from your own life that you've never quite been able to explain. These stories, they're not just entertainment. They're invitations to acknowledge the experiences that we're taught to dismiss, to give voice to the moments that changed us in ways we couldn't articulate. And I want you to know that your story matters too. Whatever you've experienced, whatever you've witnessed, whatever has happened to you in a hospital or any other place that exists between the ordinary and the extraordinary, it deserves to be heard. So please take a moment and share your own experience in the comments. Tell us about the moment that made you question everything you thought you knew. Tell us about the loved one who visited you after they were gone, or the presence you felt in an empty room, or the coincidence that was too perfect to be random. And if you have ideas for stories you'd like us to explore, themes that resonate with your own experiences, share those too. This isn't just my channel or my journey, it's ours, together. Every comment, every story, every shared moment of vulnerability makes this community stronger and more meaningful. So don't hold back. Your truth is safe here. Your experience is valid here. And I promise you, someone else who reads your words will feel less alone because you had the courage to speak. The next 2 days passed in a state of heightened awareness that bordered on paranoia. Emily found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, checking reflections in windows and mirrors, searching for any sign of her impossible double. She avoided the 7th floor when possible, taking longer routes through the hospital to complete her rounds and fulfill her responsibilities. She barely slept, afraid of what might happen if she let her guard down, if she closed her eyes and allowed some other version of herself to take control. Her colleagues noticed the change in her demeanor. Marcus Chen pulled her aside twice to ask if she was okay, if she needed to talk to someone, if the pressure of the residency was becoming too much. Each time, she reassured him with lies that felt necessary to maintain some semblance of normalcy. On Thursday evening, Emily received a message from the hospital's research department. Dr. Patricia Winters, the director of clinical research, Wanted to see her in her office first thing Friday morning. The message was polite but firm, offering no explanation for the meeting, no hint about what might be discussed. Emily's first thought was that somehow Dr. Winters had discovered her unauthorized presence near the research wing, that security footage had caught her confrontation with her double, that she was about to be questioned about things she couldn't begin to explain. She spent Thursday night in her apartment, pacing the small space, rehearsing explanations that sounded absurd even to her own ears. Friday morning arrived with overcast skies and a dampness in the air that seemed to seep into everything. Emily dressed carefully, choosing her most professional attire, as if the right clothes could somehow protect her from whatever was coming. She arrived at St. Catherine's 30 minutes before her scheduled meeting, using the extra time to gather her courage and prepare her mind for difficult questions. At exactly 8 o'clock, she knocked on Dr. Winters' office door and heard a calm voice invite her to enter. Patricia Winters was a woman in her late 50s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and intelligent eyes that seemed to see far more than most people revealed. She had been at St. Catherine's for 20 years, overseeing research projects that pushed the boundaries of medical understanding, and she had a reputation for being both brilliant and unconventional in her thinking. She gestured for Emily to sit in one of the comfortable chairs facing her desk, then poured 2 cups of coffee from a carafe without asking if Emily wanted any. "Dr. Parker, thank you for coming. I imagine you're wondering why I asked to see you." Emily accepted the coffee with hands that were steadier than she expected, and nodded silently. Dr. Winters took a slow sip of her own coffee, her gaze never leaving Emily's face, as if she were studying a particularly interesting specimen under a microscope. "I've been reviewing the security footage from the past week, not because of any specific concern, but because I like to keep track of who enters and exits the research wing. It helps me maintain proper protocols and ensure our work remains secure. And I noticed something curious. You appear on the footage 3 times in the past 5 days, entering the research wing at odd hours, always in the middle of the night. Yet when I check the electronic access logs, there's no record of your keycard being used. No record of you requesting or receiving clearance. It's as if you simply walked through a locked door without any authorization whatsoever." Emily's throat went dry, and she set down her coffee cup before her shaking hands could betray her completely. She had no explanation that would make sense, no rational response that wouldn't make her sound either delusional or dishonest. But before she could attempt any kind of answer, Dr. Winters held up a hand to stop her. "Before you try to explain, I need to tell you something that I haven't shared with many people. Something that I think you need to hear right now, based on what I suspect you've been experiencing. 14 years ago, I had an encounter in this hospital that changed my entire understanding of reality. I was working late in my laboratory, conducting research on cellular regeneration, when I looked up and saw myself standing on the other side of the room. Not a reflection, not a trick of the light, an exact duplicate of me, wearing the same clothes, with the same expression, existing in the same moment. We stared at each other for perhaps 30 seconds, and then the other version of me spoke. She told me that I was approaching a critical choice point in my life, a moment where the path I chose would determine not just my future, but the futures of countless patients who would benefit or suffer based on my decisions. Then she simply faded away, like mist dispersing in sunlight. Emily felt tears pricking at her eyes, not from fear, but from the overwhelming relief of being believed, of encountering someone who understood what she was experiencing without judgment or skepticism. Dr. Winters continued speaking, her voice gentle but firm. "Since that night, I've made it my mission to understand these phenomena, not through the lens of skepticism or the desperate need to explain everything away, but by accepting that our current scientific frameworks are incomplete. I've documented dozens of cases of hospital staff and patients experiencing impossible things. Encounters with deceased loved ones, premonitions that came true, moments of bilocation or temporal displacement, and I've come to understand that hospitals, particularly old hospitals like St. Catherine's, exist at a kind of threshold. We deal with life and death every day. We stand in the space between hope and despair, between healing and loss. And sometimes in places where those energies are so concentrated, the normal rules break down." She pulled out a folder from her desk drawer and placed it in front of Emily. Inside were photographs, incident reports, handwritten testimonies from staff members going back decades. Emily recognized some of the names. Doctors and nurses she had worked with, people she had considered entirely rational and grounded. Each document described experiences similar to her own, encounters with doubles. Premonitions that came true. Moments of being in two places at once. The research wing, Dr. Winters continued, is where we've been studying these phenomena more systematically, not with skepticism, but with openness. We use specialized equipment to measure electromagnetic fluctuations, to document temporal anomalies, to create a framework for understanding what exists beyond our current scientific paradigm. When your double appeared on our security footage, I knew you were experiencing something profound, and I wanted to help you understand it before it consumed you with fear. Emily found her voice at last, though it came out hoarse and uncertain. The photograph, the one dated 3 days from now. Today. How do I stop whatever's going to happen? Dr. Winters shook her head slowly, and there was profound compassion in her expression. You don't stop it, Emily. You experience it. You learn from it. The future isn't fixed, but certain events have a kind of gravitational pull. They're nexus points where multiple timelines converge, where something significant must happen to maintain the integrity of causality. Your double isn't trying to harm you. She's trying to prepare you. She's showing you what you need to become to fulfill your purpose here. Dr. Winters stood and moved to the window, looking out over the hospital grounds where early morning light was beginning to break through the clouds. In about 6 hours, a patient will be brought to the emergency department. A young woman named Sarah Mitchell, 28 years old, pregnant with her first child. She'll have been in a car accident, and her injuries will be severe. The attending physicians will focus on saving her life and the baby's life, and they'll succeed in that immediate goal. But there will be something else wrong, something subtle that the initial scans won't catch. A slow bleed in her brain that will kill her within 48 hours if it's not identified and treated. Every doctor in this hospital will miss it except one. The doctor who has been prepared by experiencing the impossible, by having her understanding of reality expanded enough to see patterns that others can't perceive. The doctor who will be standing in the third-floor corridor at exactly 2:37 this afternoon when Sarah's mother asks a question that seems irrelevant, but isn't. You, Emily. You're going to save her life because you've been open to possibilities that most doctors would dismiss. Your double wasn't haunting you. She was training you to see beyond the obvious. Emily sat in stunned silence, trying to process everything Dr. Winters had just revealed. The photograph in her pocket suddenly felt less like a curse and more like a map, a guide to a moment that she was meant to inhabit. She pulled it out with trembling fingers and looked at it again with new understanding. The blurred patient in the image could be Sarah Mitchell. The sadness in her own expression could be the weight of knowing what was at stake. The unfamiliar corridor with its pale green walls might be somewhere in this very building that she simply hadn't recognized yet. How do you know all this? Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. How can you be so certain about what's going to happen? Dr. Winters returned to her desk and sat down, her hands folded calmly in front of her. Because this isn't the first time I've guided someone through this experience. Because the patterns repeat themselves with enough consistency that I've learned to recognize them. And because your double visited me 2 nights ago and told me exactly what I needed to tell you today. Time isn't linear, Emily. Not in the way we've been taught to believe. It's more like a web, with multiple strands connecting past, present, and future in ways that create loops and echoes. Your double exists because you will exist, because the choices you make today create the necessity for her to reach back and prepare you. It's causality folding back on itself. Emily felt the foundations of her understanding shifting once again, but this time instead of fear, she felt a strange sense of calm settling over her. If what Dr. Winters said was true, then her experiences over the past few days hadn't been random or malicious. They had been purposeful, designed to expand her consciousness enough to perceive what needed to be perceived, to act when action was required. She thought about all the years she had spent in medical school and residency, learning to trust only what could be measured and proven, and she realized how much that rigid thinking had limited her ability to truly help her patients. Medicine wasn't just about blood tests and CT scans and pharmaceutical interventions. It was about intuition and connection, and being open to information that came through channels science hadn't yet learned to measure. "What do I do now?" Emily asked, and she was surprised to find that she genuinely wanted guidance, wanted to surrender her need for total control and trust in something larger than herself. "You go about your day normally," Dr. Winters replied. "You see your patients, you do your rounds, and when the moment comes, when you find yourself in that corridor at that specific time, you trust yourself. You trust that you'll know what to ask, what to look for, what action to take. The expanded awareness you've gained over the past few days will guide you. Your double has already lived this moment. She knows it works out. She knows you succeed. All you have to do is be present and trust the process." Emily nodded slowly, then stood to leave. But as she reached the door, she turned back with one more question. "Will I see her again? My double?" Dr. Winters smiled, and it was a smile of deep understanding. "You'll see her every time you look in a mirror, Emily, because after today, after you save Sarah Mitchell's life, you'll understand that you and she are the same person. She's not separate from you. She's the version of you that exists with full knowledge of what you're capable of when you stop limiting yourself to only what seems rational and possible. She's your future self, yes, but she's also your present self, the one you've always had the potential to become." The morning passed with agonizing slowness. Emily completed her rounds with mechanical efficiency, her mind only partly focused on the routine medical tasks. She kept checking her watch, counting down the hours and minutes until 2:37 in the afternoon, when everything Dr. Winters had predicted would supposedly come to pass. Part of her still resisted, still wanted to dismiss this entire experience as some kind of elaborate delusion or stress-induced breakdown. But another part of her, a part that had been growing stronger since she first found that impossible photograph, knew that she was approaching a threshold moment, a point of transformation that couldn't be avoided or denied. At 1:15 in the afternoon, the emergency department paged trauma alerts throughout the hospital. A major vehicle accident on the interstate, multiple casualties incoming, all available staff to report for potential assistance. Emily was in the middle of reviewing lab results when the page came through, and she immediately made her way to the emergency department, joining the organized chaos of doctors, nurses, and technicians preparing to receive the injured. The ambulances began arriving 10 minutes later, bringing a steady stream of patients with varying degrees of injury. Emily assisted where she could, taking vital signs, starting IV lines, helping to stabilize patients before they were moved to surgery or admitted to the wards. And then, at exactly 1:43 in the afternoon, Sarah Mitchell arrived. Emily saw her wheeled in on a gurney, her pregnant belly visible beneath the trauma blankets, her face pale but conscious, her eyes wide with fear and pain. The attending trauma surgeon took charge immediately, barking orders to the team, calling for CT scans and blood work and consultation with obstetrics. Emily found herself drawn to Sarah's bedside even though she hadn't been assigned to this case, even though there were plenty of other doctors handling the situation. She took Sarah's hand and squeezed it gently, offering silent reassurance while the medical team worked around them. "My baby," Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse and desperate. "Please tell me my baby is okay." "The doctors are doing everything they can," Emily replied, keeping her voice calm and steady. "They're excellent at what they do. You're both going to be taken care of." Over the next hour, Emily watched as Sarah was stabilized, scanned, evaluated, and eventually admitted to the obstetrics ward with a diagnosis of minor placental abruption and several fractured ribs. The baby appeared to be fine. Sarah's vital signs were stable. The trauma team considered it a successful outcome and moved on to other patients who needed their attention. Emily returned to her regular duties, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was incomplete, that there was a missing piece everyone was overlooking. At 2:20 in the afternoon, Emily found herself drawn to the third floor, following an impulse she didn't fully understand. She walked the corridors with no particular destination in mind, simply allowing her feet to carry her where they wanted to go. The hallways were quieter than usual, with most of the afternoon staff busy with their rounds or occupied in patient rooms. The light filtering through the windows had a golden quality, dust motes dancing in the beams like tiny stars. Emily turned a corner and found herself in a section of the building she rarely visited, where the walls were painted a pale green color that triggered a jolt of recognition. This was the corridor from the photograph. This was where she was meant to be. At exactly 2:37 in the afternoon, a woman in her 60s appeared at the far end of the corridor, walking toward Emily with quick, anxious steps. Emily recognized her from the emergency department. This was Sarah Mitchell's mother, Margaret, who had arrived shortly after the ambulances to be with her daughter. Margaret's face was drawn with worry, and when she saw Emily, she hurried forward, as if she had been searching specifically for her. "Dr. Parker, thank goodness I found you. I know Sarah's being taken care of. I know the doctor said everything is going to be fine. But there's something that's been bothering me, and I can't get anyone to listen." Emily felt her awareness sharpen, felt every sense becoming more acute, as if she were suddenly perceiving multiple layers of reality simultaneously. This was the moment. This was why her double had appeared, why the photograph existed, why she had been prepared through days of impossible experiences. She gave Margaret her full attention. "I'm listening, Mrs. Mitchell. Tell me what's bothering you." Margaret twisted her hands together, clearly uncertain whether she should even voice her concern. "It's probably nothing, and I don't want to seem like an overprotective mother, but Sarah called me this morning before the accident. She said she had the worst headache of her life, that it came on suddenly while she was driving to work. She said it felt like something exploded in her head. I told her to pull over and call an ambulance, but she said it passed after a few minutes, said she felt better and was going to continue to work. Then an hour later, she had the accident. What if the headache and the accident are connected? What if something is wrong that the scans didn't show?" Emily's mind began racing, connecting pieces of information that suddenly formed a coherent and terrifying picture. Sudden severe headache described as something exploding. Brief loss of consciousness or awareness sufficient to cause a vehicle accident. Current stability that masked an underlying catastrophe waiting to unfold. She knew what this was. She had studied it in medical school, had seen case presentations, had read the grim statistics about mortality rates when diagnosis was delayed. Cerebral aneurysm rupture with initial stabilization, followed by catastrophic rebleed, if not treated immediately. "Mrs. Mitchell, thank you for telling me this. You may have just saved your daughter's life." Emily didn't wait for a response. She was already running toward the obstetrics ward, her mind calculating time frames and treatment protocols, her heart pounding with the urgency of what needed to happen in the next few minutes. She found Sarah's room and immediately began a focused neurological examination, looking for subtle signs that the initial trauma evaluation might have missed. Slight asymmetry in pupil response. Minimal confusion when asked to repeat a complex phrase, a complaint of neck stiffness that had been attributed to the accident but could indicate something far more serious. She paged the neurosurgery team stat, then personally walked Sarah's chart to the radiology department and insisted on an immediate CT angiogram, despite protests about protocol and proper channels. She stayed with Sarah through the scan, holding her hand, offering reassurance while silently praying that her intuition was right, that she wasn't overreacting, that the expanded awareness she had been given would prove accurate. When the images appeared on the screen, the radiologist's expression changed from mild annoyance at being rushed to grave concern. There it was, visible in stark detail now that they knew to look for it. A small aneurysm at the junction of the middle cerebral artery, with evidence of recent rupture and active bleeding. The next 6 hours became a blur of coordinated medical intervention. Emergency surgery to clip the aneurysm before it could rupture again catastrophically. Careful monitoring of both Sarah and her unborn baby throughout the procedure. The delicate balance between saving a life and protecting the new life growing within. Emily assisted in the surgery, her hands steady, her mind clear, her awareness expanded enough to anticipate needs before they were voiced. And when Sarah was finally wheeled into recovery, stable and expected to make a full recovery, Emily felt something shift inside her, some fundamental change in how she understood her role as a healer. She walked back to that pale green corridor on the 3rd floor, the one from the photograph, and she wasn't surprised to find someone waiting for her there. Her double stood near the windows, bathed in the golden afternoon light, and for the first time, Emily looked at her without fear. She approached slowly, and when they were standing face to face, she saw that her double was smiling with genuine warmth and pride. "You did it," the other Emily said softly. "You trusted yourself. You listened to the information that came through channels your training taught you to ignore. You saved her." Emily nodded, feeling tears sliding down her cheeks, though she couldn't say if they were tears of exhaustion or relief or something deeper, something like gratitude for the impossible journey she had been taken on. "Are you really me? From the future?" The double's smile widened slightly. "I'm you from all times, Emily. Past, present, future, all existing simultaneously. I'm the you that remembers this moment and the you that's living it and the you that will look back on it years from now and understand its significance. Time isn't a line, it's a sphere, and we exist at every point on its surface at once. You're starting to perceive that now. You're starting to understand what you're truly capable of." Emily pulled out the photograph from her pocket and looked at it one more time. The image now made perfect sense. This corridor, this moment, this feeling of profound significance. She pulled a pen from her lab coat and turned the photograph over, then carefully wrote 3 words on the back in her own handwriting. "I'm still here." Not as a message of haunting or warning, but as an affirmation of presence, of consciousness extending beyond the normal boundaries of time and space. "What happens now?" she asked, but when she looked up, her double was gone. She was alone in the corridor, holding a photograph of herself that would somehow make its way back to Tuesday morning, back to the beginning of this strange loop of causality and consciousness. She didn't understand the mechanism, didn't need to understand it. Some things existed beyond explanation, and that was okay. That was beautiful even. In the days that followed, Emily Parker discovered that her experience had fundamentally altered how she practiced medicine. She found herself noticing things she would have previously dismissed, the subtle changes in a patient's energy that preceded measurable clinical decline, the patterns in seemingly random symptoms that pointed to diagnoses others missed, the way certain patients seemed to know things about their own conditions that they couldn't possibly know through conventional means, and learning to trust those intuitions rather than dismissing them as anxiety or confusion. Her diagnostic accuracy improved dramatically, and her colleagues began to notice. Within a month, she had identified 3 critical conditions that would have been missed by standard protocols, saving lives through a combination of medical knowledge and something else, something that didn't have a name in the textbooks but was no less real for its ineffability. Marcus Chen pulled her aside one evening after a particularly long shift, his expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Emily, something's changed with you. You're different somehow. More present, more aware. I can't quite put my finger on it, but it's like you're operating on a different level than the rest of us. What happened?" Emily considered telling him everything, sharing the full story of her encounter with her double and the journey into expanded consciousness that had followed. But she knew that some experiences couldn't be adequately conveyed through words, that they had to be lived and felt and integrated personally. Instead, she smiled and put a hand on his shoulder. "I just learned to trust myself more," she said simply. "To listen to all the information available, not just what appears in lab results and imaging studies. We're taught in medical school to rely only on objective data, but humans are more than just biological machines. Sometimes the most important information comes through channels we haven't learned to measure yet." Marcus nodded thoughtfully, and Emily could see he understood more than her words explicitly stated. He was a good doctor, intuitive and compassionate, and she suspected he had his own experiences with the inexplicable, his own moments when the normal rules seemed to bend or break. They stood together in comfortable silence for a moment, 2 healers trying their best to serve their patients while navigating a profession that demanded both scientific rigor and human connection, both clinical detachment and deep empathy. Sarah Mitchell made a full recovery, as did her baby. Emily visited them several times during their extended hospital stay, watching as Sarah grew stronger each day, as the color returned to her face and the light returned to her eyes. On the day of their discharge, Sarah's mother, Margaret, pulled Emily aside with tears streaming down her face. "You saved both of them. The other doctors told me that if you hadn't insisted on that scan, if you hadn't trusted my concern about the headache, Sarah would have had another bleed within 24 hours. Fatal, they said. You listened when no one else would. How can I ever thank you for that?" Emily embraced the older woman, feeling the depth of her gratitude and relief, understanding that she had been part of something larger than herself, something that connected her double and Dr. Winters and the strange architecture of time itself into a web of causality designed to preserve life when it could be preserved. You already thanked me by trusting your intuition enough to find me and share what you knew, Emily replied softly. We saved her together, Mrs. Mitchell. Never doubt that a mother's knowledge of her child is a form of wisdom that medicine needs to respect. Dr. Patricia Winters called Emily to her office one more time, about 2 weeks after the incident with Sarah Mitchell. This time there was no tension in the invitation, no sense of being called to account for strange behavior. Emily entered the familiar space and found Dr. Winters pouring coffee again, the same ritual as before, but with an entirely different emotional tone. I wanted to check in with you, Dr. Winters said as they settled into their chairs, to see how you're integrating the experience, how you're managing the expanded awareness you've gained. Emily took a sip of her coffee and considered the question carefully. It's been challenging, but also incredibly rewarding. I feel like I'm finally practicing medicine the way it was meant to be practiced, with the whole person in view, not just their measurable symptoms. But I also feel isolated sometimes, knowing things I can't fully explain to my colleagues, seeing patterns they don't see. It can be lonely. Dr. Winters nodded with understanding. That loneliness is something everyone who goes through this experience feels initially. But I want you to know you're not alone. There's a community of us, doctors and nurses and other healthcare workers throughout this hospital and others, who have had similar experiences, who operate with expanded awareness. We meet informally, share our observations, support each other in navigating the tension between what we know and what we can prove. I'd like to invite you to join us, if you're interested. Emily felt a weight she hadn't known she was carrying lift from her shoulders. The prospect of connecting with others who understood, who wouldn't dismiss her experiences or think she had lost her grip on reality, filled her with profound relief. I would like that very much, she said. Dr. Winters smiled and pulled out a business card with a phone number handwritten on the back. We meet the first Friday of every month, after hours, in the old chapel on the hospital's west side. The one that's been converted into a meditation room. Come whenever you feel ready. There's no pressure, no judgment, just people trying to be better healers by accepting that healing involves mysteries we may never fully understand. That night, alone in her apartment, Emily laid out all the strange artifacts of her experience on her kitchen table. The photograph dated 3 days in the future that she had written on herself. The white button from her lab coat that had somehow appeared in Mrs. Harrison's room. The notes she had taken during her research into bilocation and temporal anomalies. She studied them like a detective reviewing evidence from a case, trying to find the thread that connected everything into a coherent narrative. But she realized, as she sat there in the quiet darkness, that coherence wasn't the point. Mystery was the point. Wonder was the point. The recognition that reality was far stranger and more beautiful than any single explanatory framework could capture. She thought about her double, about that other version of herself who existed outside normal time, who had reached back to prepare her for a moment when preparation mattered. Was her double still out there somewhere, watching over her, guiding her toward other critical moments? Or had she served her purpose and dissolved back into whatever dimension she had emerged from? Emily didn't know, and she found that she was comfortable with not knowing. Some questions didn't need answers. Some experiences needed to remain inexplicable to retain their power to transform. Over the following months, Emily continued to develop her abilities, learning to trust the subtle signals her expanded awareness provided. She began attending the monthly meetings Dr. Winters had mentioned, connecting with a remarkable group of healthcare workers who shared their own stories of encounters with the impossible. A nurse who could sense when patients were about to take a critical turn, who would position herself near their rooms minutes before alarms began sounding. A respiratory therapist who had conversations with patients' deceased loved ones in empty hallways, receiving information that helped with treatment decisions. A surgeon who occasionally felt guided hands assisting during complex procedures, hands that belonged to no living person, but seemed to know exactly where to cut and where to preserve. These were good people, dedicated professionals who hadn't abandoned science but had learned to expand their definition of what science could encompass. They worked within the conventional medical system while privately acknowledging that the system's current frameworks were incomplete, that healing involved dimensions of consciousness and connection that couldn't be reduced to biochemistry and anatomy. Emily found herself at home among them in a way she had never felt at home before, and she understood that her experience with her double had been an initiation into a larger community of awakened healers. She never saw her double again, at least not in the way she had seen her that night in the corridor. But sometimes, when she looked in mirrors, she thought she caught glimpses of something more than her physical reflection. A depth in her eyes that suggested vast experiences beyond her conscious memory. A presence that extended before and after her current moment in time. A connection to all the versions of herself that existed simultaneously across the strange topology of consciousness and causality. And in those moments, she would smile, remembering the journey she had taken, the fear she had faced, the transformation she had undergone. Sarah Mitchell sent her a birth announcement 6 months later, a healthy baby girl named Emma, with Sarah's eyes and her father's smile. Enclosed with the announcement was a handwritten note that made Emily cry when she read it. "Thank you for saving us both. Thank you for listening when it mattered most. Emma will grow up knowing that she's alive because one doctor was brave enough to trust what couldn't be proven. You're her guardian angel, whether you believe in angels or not." Emily kept the note in her lab coat pocket, right where the impossible photograph had been. A reminder of why she had chosen medicine in the first place. Why she endured the exhausting hours and emotional strain and constant weight of responsibility. Because sometimes, when everything aligned correctly, when training met intuition and science met mystery and courage met necessity, doctors could perform genuine miracles. Not the flashy miracles of religious texts, but the quiet miracles of listening and perceiving and acting on information that came through unconventional channels. The miracles of being fully present, fully aware, fully committed to preserving life in all its precious fragility. Years later, when Emily had completed her residency and joined the staff at St. Catherine's as an attending physician, she would occasionally guide younger doctors through their own encounters with the inexplicable. She recognized the signs easily, the haunted look in their eyes, the questions they couldn't quite articulate, the tension between what they had witnessed and what they had been taught was possible. And she would share her story with them, carefully and compassionately, offering them the same gift that Dr. Winters had offered her. The gift of knowing they weren't crazy or delusional. The gift of understanding that their experiences were real and valid and potentially transformative. The gift of community with others who walked the same strange path between science and mystery. She kept the photograph in a locked drawer in her office, taking it out occasionally to remember where her journey had begun. The image never changed, never faded, existing somehow outside the normal flow of time like the experience it documented. And every time she looked at it, she felt grateful for the terror and confusion and ultimate transformation it represented. Because that photograph, that impossible artifact from a future that became present, that became past, had taught her the most important lesson of her medical career. That the boundaries between possible and impossible were far more permeable than anyone acknowledged. That consciousness was stranger and more powerful than conventional science admitted. And that the real miracles happened not when the laws of nature were suspended, but when human awareness expanded enough to perceive the laws that had always been operating beyond our limited perceptions. St. Catherine's Medical Center continued its work, day after day, year after year, standing at the threshold between life and death, between hope and despair, between the known and the unknowable. And within its walls, a community of healers practiced medicine with their eyes open to dimensions of reality that most people never perceived, serving their patients with both scientific rigor and spiritual wisdom, with both clinical skill and expanded consciousness. They saved lives in conventional ways and unconventional ways, trusting data when data was sufficient and trusting intuition when intuition was what the moment required. And they did so knowing that the deepest truths about healing, about consciousness, about the nature of time and self and existence itself, would always retain an element of mystery that no amount of research or study could fully penetrate. Emily Parker had become the doctor she was meant to be. Not despite her encounter with the impossible, but because of it. Not by rejecting science, but by recognizing that science was just one way of knowing among many. Not by abandoning reason, but by accepting that reason alone was insufficient to navigate the full complexity of human existence. She had learned to hold multiple truths simultaneously. That diseases had biological causes that could be treated with medications and surgeries. And that healing involved something more, something that touched on meaning and connection, and the mysterious ways consciousness could transcend the normal boundaries of space and time. She had learned to be both skeptical and open, both rigorous and intuitive, both grounded and willing to soar into territories where conventional maps offered no guidance. And on quiet nights, when the hospital settled into its nocturnal rhythms and the boundaries between worlds seemed thinnest, she would sometimes pause in her rounds and feel the presence of her double nearby, not as something separate or other, but as an aspect of herself that existed beyond the limitations of linear time. She would feel the connection to all the versions of herself across past and future and parallel possibilities, all the choices made and unmade, all the lives saved and unsaved, all the moments of courage and fear and transformation woven together into the strange tapestry of her existence. And she would understand, in a way that went beyond words or concepts, that she had never really been alone, that none of us are ever really alone, that consciousness extends in directions we can barely imagine, connecting us to each other and to versions of ourselves across time in ways that make every moment pregnant with significance. The hospital continued its eternal vigil, its lights burning through the darkness, its doors always open to those who suffered and sought healing. And within its walls, the work continued. The mysterious work of mending broken bodies and broken spirits, the sacred work of standing witness to birth and death, and all the moments in between. The impossible work of being human in a universe stranger and more wonderful than anyone fully comprehends. And Emily Parker, who had once believed only in what could be measured and proven, who had been transformed by an encounter with her own impossible reflection, who had learned to practice medicine with her whole being rather than just her trained intellect, continued to serve, continued to heal, continued to walk the razor's edge between science and mystery with grace and courage and an open heart. In the end, perhaps the real miracle was fear. Fear that pushed her to investigate rather than ignore. Fear that opened her to possibilities she would have otherwise rejected. Fear that transformed into courage, into wisdom, into a deeper understanding of what it meant to be a healer in a world where the impossible happened every day to those brave enough to acknowledge it. The fear that became the doorway to everything she was meant to become.